Welcome to the latest update from Iguacu, your trusted source for effective overseas giving at weareiguacu.org. My name's Catherine Davies and I'm the CEO and founder, and I'll be joined shortly by lead researchers from our research desk at Iguacu. So please don't hesitate to post your questions about any of the crises we cover, any of the charities we recommend. Don't hesitate to post a question. We'd love to hear from you. So this week we have an update from Nat, who's unable to join us live, but he was able to send me this update from you. Nathanael Shiraki is our lead researcher for Syria and Iraq, and he has an update on what's been happening in eastern Ghouta. You may have heard at least 20,000 people have managed to leave the besieged area. Most of those interviewed by the UN in refugee camps suffered from medical conditions including trauma, hepatitis, and intestinal infection. Even inside eastern Ghouta, our recommended charity, SAMS, you can donate to at weareiguacu.org, is providing aid every day to the sick and injured. In the past month, SAMS alone has been able to reach more civilians in eastern Ghouta than the interagency international convoys. SAMS has also provided food baskets to vulnerable Syrians taking refuge in underground shelters, reaching over 100,000 people. I think that must be 10,000 people. Sorry, this just came through on the wire from Nat, and he will correct me shortly. They constantly reinforce and resupply medical facilities as conditions permit. And I believe he is referring to, it would have to be 10,000 people, yes. So, also, perhaps more anecdotally, but it is just as crucial, SAMS has been distributing meals to medical workers at health facilities. Indeed, medical workers are working around the clock to treat the injured and ill, unable to leave their healthcare facilities due to the dangers outside or due to the overwhelming influx of wounded patients. Thank you very much for that update, Nathanael, if you're tuning in. And I just wanted to share, before we leave the subject of Syria, a quote from Stephen Hawking. This was an article he penned, an opinion piece in the Washington Post back in 2014. What's happening in Syria is an abomination, one that the world is watching coldly from a distance. Where is our emotional intelligence, our sense of collective justice? Well, we know that there are things you can do to support the Syrian people, and one of them you can act through Iguacu. So it doesn't take long. It takes seconds at weareiguacu.org, because we're all about making it easy for you to act on your compassionate response to large-scale human suffering. That's what Iguacu is all about. So first up from the research team is Adib Chowdhury, our lead researcher on natural disasters and hazards around the world, and I will just attempt to bring Adib. And here we are. Thanks for joining us, Adib.
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Can hear you loud and clear. And what do you have to report from the last week? Thanks, Adib.
Well, just an update on some of the news from Papua New Guinea. As you might have heard, on the 26th of February, Papua New Guinea was affected by a huge earthquake, one of the largest it's seen in the past few years. And most of the damage occurred from the ensuing mudslides that happened, and this hampered a lot of access for aid agencies into the villages that were worst affected. And right now, the death toll is looking over 100 to 120 people, over that. And so it's important to look at one of the most overlooked reasons being due to structural damage in the affected areas. And something that isn't quite often discussed in some of the articles that we're seeing is that in Papua New Guinea, actually a lot of the houses in the remote areas were made out of traditional materials. So, you know, things like wooden beams and materials such as straw and dried vegetation. Now, actually, interestingly, these structures turn out to be more earthquake resistant than some of the modern buildings because they can flex as the earth sways, as the ground shakes below them. And as we're seeing more and more people move from rural areas into the cities, which are made out of brick housing, the problem that you get is that in, for example, the Mexico earthquake, these buildings, these brick buildings, need to be, have a lot of stringent measures to them, and they need to be checked for structural, how earthquake-proof they are. And a lot of them, unfortunately, aren't. And so in this instance, a lot of people in these brick buildings found that, they were susceptible to collapse.
So the modern buildings have the regulations, but they're not necessarily being followed or supervised or checked or monitored.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Unfortunately, that's the case. And as I said, we saw this happen most recently in Mexico, in the Mexico quake too. It was a big issue. And in fact,
it's no surprise that the indigenous people in rural Papua New Guinea have been living in an earthquake zone for quite some time, that they have, adapted to that and created structures that are resistant to it.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting to see because, a recent conversation that I had with someone he's a disaster resilience expert from the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network. He was telling me how important it is to pay attention for international NGOs that come over, especially after, mass disasters such as this earthquake, to pay attention to whether local practices have been in place already and the local NGOs working there, because they know the community well. And there might be some, a reason why the buildings are made like that. And they've served these communities very well in the past for situations such as earthquakes. So it just goes to show how important it is to pay attention to any pre-existing knowledge that there might be towards disaster resilience, and just how careful international agencies have to be when they're flying into these areas.
Yeah, so often we found at Iguacu, it's not a rule that applies in every case, but so often we found actors that have been engaged in that community for a significant length of time when the disaster hits tend to be the ones, if they have the right procedures in place and relationships and have all the other aspects of effectiveness in place. If they've been in place for quite some time, they tend to be usually the what ends up becoming an effective recommendation from Iguacu's point of view, because they had this knowledge, this local knowledge, this relationship with local people, local customs, local culture. They understand so much of the lay of the land. So it's no surprise that they tend to be the ones that end up being the recommendation for Iguacu, for the public.
Exactly.
Iguacu. And that's just another example. Any other news from your world this week, Adib?
That's all for today. That's all for this week. So
very good.
Hopefully see you next week.
We'll see you next week. Thanks, Adib.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. So next up we have Blondine Sidinier, and Blondine is our lead researcher from Central Africa, and I'll just bring Blondine in to join us, and she'll be updating us on South Sudan and potentially as well on the Central African Republic. And just waiting now for the connection. Hello, Blondine. How are you?
Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Very well, thank you. South Sudan, you have some news for us on South Sudan?
Yes, exactly, because last week the UN voted to renew its peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. The mission has an authorized troops selling of 17,000 and at the moment...
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you said. Could you just repeat that again? That they've decided to stay on, and what was the next piece, sorry?
The fact that the mission has an authorized troops selling of 17,000, and at the moment 14,000 peacekeepers are deployed throughout South Sudan, making it the second biggest UN operation after the one in the Congo, the DRC.
Okay.
And in addition, the UN adopted a tougher stance, threatening to impose an arms embargo if leaders fail to commit to peace.
Okay, so adding calls to the earlier urgency by the Americans. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Thank you, Blondine. And from the Central African Republic, do you have any news?
Well, Yes, last week, a militia leader was arrested in the center of the Central African Republic. He's accused of human rights violations and of participating in an attack against UN peacekeepers during last December, during which a peacekeeper was killed. It is the latest development in a general effort to render justice in the Central African Republic, where it's a major issue, as the legal system is barely functioning. Earlier in March, several militiamen were sentenced to life in prison, and a militia leader received the same sentence back in January. So these are positive developments.
They sound like very baby steps, but they're in the right direction.
Exactly.
Look, thank you so much, Blondine.
Thank you, Catherine.
We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you. Bye. So I'll just check in to see if there's any questions from you. I don't seem to see a question. Let me just double check. Okay. So just to finish up, to explain, Iguacu exists to address the frustration that the public feels when they want to reach out where the needs are critical in the world. There is so many crises in the news, and it can be difficult to know which crisis to respond to and which charity to support. And there's quite a lot of frustration around that. When there was the last major earthquake in Nepal, for example, there were more than 300 charities online, many making similar claims. And so it's no surprise that it's a challenge for the public online to understand which charity to donate. Now, the problem with all that lost intention is that it's lost intention where the needs are really the most critical around the world. So the whole point of Iguacu is not to lose it. It's quite the opposite. It's to become a well-known name, a trusted name, so that when you hear of large-scale suffering in the world, you think, what does Iguacu think? And you can find out a genuinely effective charity on the ground. So instead of letting go of that intention to do something about it, you can act on it. And we're very user-centered at Iguacu. We are determined, dedicated to making sure you have a positive experience using the platform weareiguacu.org. That it's very quick, that it doesn't take long, that you can just jump in, choose a crisis, choose a charity and go. And for those people who really aren't sure which crisis, there is an option on the Iguacu platform called Where the Needs Are Great. And many people, especially American donors, as we are a 501c3, choose to donate monthly through Iguacu, and they choose this option Where the Need is Great. And what that means is every month they get an email from Iguacu with an impact update. Every January they get an annual statement. And it just makes the whole process of overseas giving effortless. Meanwhile, they know that there's an expert team curating their overseas giving. And we are monitoring crises and monitoring the effectiveness of these charities all year long. There are more than 900 experts that inform the Iguacu service. So please, I encourage you to join us today, no matter how small the donation. Join the Iguacu journey, because you can make a difference where the needs are critical around the world. Thank you for joining us this week, and see you next week. Bye for now.